The wind on the high plains of Wyoming was not a gentle thing. It was a predator, a relentless hunter of warmth and hope, and on this night, it had found its quarry. A single, dilapidated wagon, its back wheel splintered and shattered, sat listing in the ever-deepening snow like a ship foundering in a frozen sea. Inside, huddled together under thin, threadbare blankets, were 24 girls, their ages ranging from the tender age of 5 to the cusp of womanhood at 17. Their breath plumed in the frigid air, small ghosts of their fading vitality. Standing guard by the broken wheel, her shawl pulled tight against the biting gale, was Alara Vance. The snow had plastered her dark hair to her scalp and her face was numb with cold, but her eyes, the color of a stormy sky, were fixed on the impenetrable white darkness that surrounded them. She was their governess, their protector, their last and only bastion against a world that had offered them nothing but cruelty and abandonment. They had fled the wickedness of a man who saw them as chattel, as assets to be sold or bartered, and had set out for a rumored sanctuary in the West. But the West was a harsh and unforgiving God, and it seemed they had only traded one form of destruction for another. The last of the food was nearly gone. The wood for their small, sputtering stove had been exhausted hours ago, and the cold was no longer just a discomfort. It was a physical weight, a crushing presence that was slowly, inexorably squeezing the life from them all. One of the youngest, a little girl named Sarah with eyes too big for her pale face, began to cry, a thin, weak sound that was almost immediately swallowed by the howl of the wind. Alara pushed herself away from the wagon and climbed back inside, her movements stiff and clumsy. She gathered the child into her arms, ignoring the icy stiffness of her own clothes. She could feel the tremors running through the small body, the weak, fluttering heartbeat. She looked at the other faces, shadowed and fearful in the gloom, all turned towards her. They were a constellation of silent, desperate questions, and she had no answers. Her own hope, once a steady flame, had dwindled to a single, sputtering ember, and the icy breath of the blizzard was threatening to extinguish it for good. Her mind, usually so sharp and ordered, felt like a frozen pond, its surface cracked and fractured. She remembered the promises of their escape, the whispered dreams of a new life, a place where they could be safe, where the girls could grow and maybe even find happiness. It all seemed a cruel mockery now, a child's fairy tale told in the face of an executioner. The world had been reduced to this single terrible point. A broken wagon, 24 freezing children, and the vast, indifferent emptiness of the snow-swept plains. She held Sarah tighter, trying to pour her own dwindling warmth into the child, and began to hum a quiet lullaby. The tune was fragile, a thread of sound against the roaring tempest, a testament to a courage she did not feel, a prayer sent into a void that did not seem to listen. She was the resilient survivor, but even resilience had its limits, and she could feel herself standing on the very edge of that final, desolate cliff. Have you ever felt a silence so profound that it feels like the end of the world? A quiet so deep it seems the very heart of the earth has ceased to beat? For Silas Croft, that silence was not an end, but a fortress. For 10 years, the silence of his sprawling, isolated ranch had been the walls he built around the ruin of his heart. The wind that howled outside was just a distant cousin to the storm that had raged within him and then, mercifully, frozen solid. He had lost everything that mattered. A wife with a laugh like summer rain, a son with his mother's eyes, to a fever that had swept through the valley like a phantom thief. After that, he had turned his back on the world of men, on its noise and its pointless connections, and had embraced the stark, unforgiving beauty of his solitude. His life was a litany of hard work and quiet ritual. Mending fences, tending to his small herd of hardy cattle, chopping wood, and sitting by his cold hearth with ghosts for company. But have you ever wondered what happens when an unstoppable force of desperation meets an immovable object of grief? This is the story of such a collision. It is the story of how 25 souls, lost in a storm, stumbled upon a man who was lost in his own. It is a story that asks if a heart, frozen solid for a decade, can ever truly thaw. Alara knew they could not stay in the wagon. To remain was to surrender, to let the cold claim them one by one. She made a decision, the kind a person makes when all other choices have been stripped away. She would take the oldest and strongest of the girls, and they would walk. She did not know where they were going, only that they must move. She wrapped their feet in torn strips of blanket, tied ropes between them so they would not be separated in the blinding snow, and with a final, desperate prayer, she led them out into the maelstrom. The wind tore at them, a physical assault that stole their breath and blinded them with ice crystals. Every step was a monumental effort, a plunge into a bottomless drift. The younger girls, left in the wagon under the care of the eldest, 17-year-old Mary, were a weight on Alara's soul, but she knew this was their only chance. Hours passed, or perhaps it was only minutes. Time had lost all meaning, replaced by the rhythm of agonizing steps and the screaming of the wind. Just as her own strength was failing, just as the blackness began to creep into the edges of her vision, she saw it. A light. It was faint, a mere pinprick of yellow in the swirling chaos of white and gray, so insubstantial she thought it was a hallucination, a final trick of a dying mind. But it did not vanish. It held steady, a tiny, defiant spark. Hope, fierce and desperate, surged through her. She pointed with a hand she could no longer feel. "There!" she screamed, her voice a raw croak. "A light! We have to get to the light!" That single point of light became their entire world, their salvation. They stumbled towards it, falling and rising, pulling each other along, their shared rope a lifeline in the heart of oblivion. Finally, they collapsed against a solid wall of wood, the rough-hewn logs of a large cabin. Porch and a door. Alara raised her frozen fist and banged on the solid oak, the sound shockingly loud in the brief lulls of the wind. She pounded again and again, using the last of her strength, her entire being focused on this one, final act. Then, the sound of a heavy bar being lifted from within, and the door creaked open, spilling a rectangle of warm, golden light onto the snow. A figure stood silhouetted in the doorway, a mountain of a man, his face lost in the shadows, his presence radiating an aura of profound and unwelcoming stillness. Silas Croft did not receive visitors. The path to his ranch was unmarked and largely forgotten, a deliberate choice he had made a decade ago. So when the frantic pounding echoed through his silent home, it felt like a violation, a sacrilege against the tomb he had so carefully constructed. He rose from his chair, his movements stiff not from age but from a deep, soul-weary habit of minimal motion. He took the heavy rifle from its pegs by the door, not out of fear of men, but out of a deep-seated caution born of living in a land that was beautiful and deadly in equal measure. He lifted the heavy wooden bar, a barrier meant to keep the world out, and pulled the door inward. The wind and snow surged into the room, a blast of Arctic cold that made the flames in his hearth hiss and dance. And there, on his porch, were figures, more than one, crusted with snow and ice, looking more like apparitions than human beings. At the front was a woman, her face a mask of desperate exhaustion, her eyes burning with a feverish intensity. Behind her, clinging to her and to each other, were several more figures, smaller, their faces hidden by hoods and shawls. His first instinct, the one honed by years of solitude, was a sharp, brutal rejection. He had no room for the troubles of the world. His own were burden enough. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice a low rumble, rusty from disuse. It was not a question but a dismissal. The woman, Alara, looked up at him, and for a moment, the sheer, intimidating size of him, the harsh, unwelcoming set of his jaw, made her falter. But the thought of the girls, both here and back in the wagon, solidified her resolve. "Shelter," she gasped, her voice thin and ragged. "Please, our wagon is broken. The children, they're freezing." Silas's eyes, the color of chipped granite, narrowed. Children. The word was a stone cast into the frozen pond of his memory, sending painful ripples across the surface. He saw a flash of a small face, a tiny hand in his. He shoved the memory down, deep into the cold darkness where it belonged. "This ain't a charity," he gritted out, his hand tightening on the doorframe. ready to push it closed and restore the silence. "I've got nothing for you." It was a lie. He had a large house, a well-stocked larder, a barn full of hay. What he didn't have was a heart for sharing. That part of him had been buried long ago. Alara took a staggering step forward, her hand outstretched in a plea. "I'm not asking for charity, sir. Just for a roof, for a fire. Until the storm passes. There are 24 of them. Most are still in the wagon. They won't survive the night." 24. The number was incomprehensible, an invasion. He could feel the walls of his fortress trembling. He looked past her at the smaller figures huddled behind her. One of them, a girl of about 16, looked up, her face blue with cold. Her eyes filled with a terror so profound it struck an old, rusted chord deep within him. It was the look of someone who knew death was near. His honor, a quality he thought he had shed along with every other human connection, stirred. It was a stubborn, unwelcome thing, a remnant of the man he used to be. The man who had been a husband, a father, a protector. He could not, in good conscience, close the door and leave them to die. The ghosts in his house would never forgive him. And perhaps, even worse, he would never forgive himself. With a low growl of pure frustration, a sound of profound defeat, he stepped back. "Get inside," he said, the words torn from him. "All of you, and tell me where the others are." The command was harsh, devoid of any warmth, but to Alara and the girls, it was the most beautiful sound in the world. It was the sound of survival. The first 24 hours were a strange and strained truce between chaos and order. Silas's home, once a silent monolith of masculine solitude, was overrun. The small, shivering bodies of 24 girls filled every corner, their wet cloaks steaming by the massive stone hearth, their hushed, fearful whispers a constant hum that vibrated against the quiet walls of his life. After Silas had taken 2 of his strongest horses and, guided by a near-frozen Alara, had retrieved the remaining children from the wagon, the house was transformed. It was no longer a home but a refugee camp, a chaotic hospital ward. He watched the transformation from his customary chair by the fire, a silent, brooding sentinel in his own domain. He felt like a stranger, his routines shattered, the sacred silence he had cultivated now filled with the sounds of crying, coughing, and the endless, rustling movements of too many people. He watched Alara, after her initial collapse from exhaustion, a brief surrender to the warmth and safety of his home. She had risen with a quiet, steely determination that both irritated and impressed him. She was a whirlwind of gentle, efficient authority. She organized the girls into groups, assigning the older ones to care for the younger. She found his stores of flour, dried beans, and salted meat and, without asking permission, began to prepare a thin but hot soup in his largest kettle. She directed the girls to lay their blankets out in neat rows in the main room, creating a makeshift dormitory. She did not ask for his help, but her presence was a constant, unspoken demand. She was bringing life, with all its messy, complicated, and noisy needs, into a house that had been dedicated to the memory of death. He observed her, his granite eyes missing nothing. He saw the way she soothed the smallest child, the firm but kind tone she used with a tearful teenager, the methodical way she assessed their meager resources and made them stretch. She was not a damsel in distress waiting for a rescuer. She was a general commanding a battered army, and his ranch was the hill she had just taken. A part of him resented her for it, for the intrusion, for making him feel things he had long since buried. But another, deeper part, the part that still remembered what it was to be a man with responsibilities, felt a flicker of something he couldn't name. It might have been respect. Late that first night, after the soup had been eaten and the girls were finally asleep, a sprawling landscape of quiet breathing on his floor, Alara approached his chair. She stood for a moment in the flickering firelight, her hands clasped before her. "Sir," she began, her voice low, "I have no way to thank you." Silas didn't look at her. He stared into the flames, at the dancing memories he saw there. "Didn't ask for thanks," he rumbled. "I need to know your plans," Alara continued, her voice gaining a bit of its strength. Once the storm breaks, we will be on our way. We won't be a burden to you for long. He finally turned his head, his gaze heavy. On your way to where? In a broken wagon with no food? That's not a plan. That's a slow death. The bluntness of his words struck her, but she did not flinch. We have to try. There's a town a few days from here. We were told there would be help. He gave a short, harsh laugh, a sound like stones grinding together. Help. People in this territory help themselves. Anyone who told you different was a liar or a fool. He saw the flicker of despair in her eyes and, for a reason he could not comprehend, he felt a sudden, unwelcome urge to temper his words. He rose from his chair and walked to a small, dusty chest in the corner. He opened it and pulled out a small, crudely carved wooden horse, its paint faded and chipped. He had made it for his son an eternity ago. He walked over to the sleeping form of the little girl, Sarah, who had cried so pitifully in the wagon. Her small hand was curled on the blanket. He gently placed the wooden horse next to it. He did the act without looking at Alara, as if it were a secret, something he was doing for himself and not for anyone else. But she saw it. She saw the profound, unspoken grief and tenderness in that simple gesture. It was the first crack in the ice of his stoic exterior, a glimpse of the man who existed beneath the layers of pain and solitude. In that moment, she understood that this gruff, solitary rancher was far more complex than he appeared. He was a man with his own ghosts, his own deep wounds, and she, in her desperation, had brought her own army of sorrows to his door. The storm raged outside, but inside the cabin, a different kind of turbulence was settling into a fragile, uncertain peace. The blizzard, as if having spent its fury, finally broke after 3 long days. It left behind a world transformed, a landscape of sculpted white drifts and blinding, sunlit silence. The immediate peril had passed, but for the inhabitants of Silas Croft's ranch, a new, more complex challenge began. The slow, awkward process of cohabitation. The ranch, once Silas's solitary kingdom, now operated on a new rhythm, one set by Alara's quiet efficiency and the pervasive presence of the children. Silas found his mornings, once a silent ritual of coffee and contemplation, invaded by the smell of porridge and the low murmur of morning prayers led by Alara. His barn, a sanctuary of ordered tools and the familiar scent of hay and leather, became a place of cautious exploration for the older girls, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination for this new world. He tried to maintain his distance, to remain the brooding observer, but he was slowly, inexorably being drawn into the orbit of this new, chaotic family. He found himself answering questions he hadn't been asked in a decade. "Mr. Croft, what's that tool for?" A 10-year-old named Lucy would ask, pointing to a leather awl, and he would grunt an explanation, surprised by the sound of his own voice teaching something. He found his work interrupted. As he was mending a fence line, a task he usually performed with meditative focus, he would look up to see a small audience of girls watching him, their faces peeking over the top rail. One day, a small girl, the same one he had given the toy horse to, Sarah, toddled up to him as he was splitting firewood. She stood a safe distance away, clutching the wooden horse, and just watched. He ignored her, the rhythmic swing and crack of the axe his only reply. But she did not leave. Finally, he stopped, leaning the axe against the block. He looked down at her. "What?" he asked, the single word rougher than he intended. She just held up the horse. "He's lonely," she said in a small, clear voice. "He needs a friend." Silas stared at her, his mind a blank. The simple, profound logic of a child was a language he had forgotten how to speak. He grunted, turned his back on her, and picked up the axe again, but the rhythm was broken. The image of the lonely wooden horse stayed with him for the rest of the day. That evening, as the stew Alara had made bubbled on the stove, filling the cabin with a warmth that went beyond mere heat, he sat at his workbench. He took a small block of pine and, with a whittling knife he hadn't touched in years, he began to carve. His hands, calloused and powerful from ranch work, moved with a surprising delicacy, a muscle memory of a softer time. He carved another horse, this one slightly smaller, less detailed, a companion for the first. He didn't sand it or paint it. He left it as it was, raw and new. He walked into the main room and, without a word, placed the new horse next to Sarah, who was listening to Alara read a story from a worn book. The little girl's eyes went wide. She looked at the new horse, then at the old one, and then up at Silas, a smile of pure, unadulterated joy spreading across her face. It was a smile so bright it felt like the sun on the snow, almost painful to look at. He turned away quickly, retreating to the shadows of his chair, but he could feel the warmth of it on his back. Later, when the children were asleep, Alara brought him a mug of hot coffee. She stood by his chair, not speaking for a long moment. "That was a kind thing to do," she said softly. He shrugged, staring into the fire. "The wood was scrap." "It wasn't about the wood," she replied. She hesitated, then asked the question that had been hovering between them since their arrival. "Why are you helping us, Mr. Croft?" He was silent for a long time, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the whisper of the wind outside. He thought of his wife, of his son. He thought of the crushing silence and the 10 years of ghosts. He thought of the noise and life that now filled his house, a disturbance that was, to his own shock, becoming less and less unwelcome. "My wife. She would have wanted it," he said, the words heavy and difficult, stones pulled from a deep well. "She never could stand to see anything suffer. Not a stray dog, not a broken-winged bird." He looked at Alara then, his gaze direct and filled with a decade of unspoken sorrow. And certainly not children. It was the most he had shared with anyone in 10 years. For Alara it was everything. It was the key that unlocked the mystery of the gruff, honorable man who had taken them in. She saw past the stoic protector to the emotionally wounded man beneath, and her heart, already filled with gratitude, now found room for a deeper, more profound empathy. The fragile trust between them was beginning to solidify, like the frozen ground beginning to thaw under the promise of a distant spring. The ranch was no longer just a shelter. It was slowly, tentatively, becoming a home. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that was neither the stark solitude of Silas's past nor the desperate chaos of the orphan's arrival. It was something new, a hybrid existence built on shared work and quiet understanding. The ranch, under Alara's gentle but firm guidance, began to transform. The dust of a decade was swept away, not just from the floors and windowsills, but from the very air of the place. The girls, once pale and fearful, began to gain color in their cheeks. Their laughter, at first a timid and rare sound, became more frequent, echoing from the barn as they learned to milk the cow or collect eggs. Silas found himself an unwitting teacher. He showed the older girls how to mend a leather harness, how to read the clouds for signs of changing weather, how to properly stack a cord of wood so it wouldn't topple. He never volunteered the lessons. They were always drawn from him by their persistent, curious questions. But he found a strange, deep satisfaction in the sharing of his knowledge, in seeing their pride as they mastered a new skill. His solitude was gone, but in its place was a sense of purpose he hadn't realized he had been starving for. The slow-burn romance between him and Alara was not one of grand declarations or passionate embraces. It was a romance of shared glances across a crowded dinner table, of silences that were no longer awkward but comfortable, of small, unspoken acts of service. It was in the way he started leaving a bucket of fresh, clean water on the porch for her every morning, and the way she always saved him the last cup of coffee, just the way he liked it. One evening, after a long day of branding the new calves, a job in which even the older girls had helped by keeping the fire stoked and the branding irons hot, they sat on the porch together. The sun was setting, painting the western sky in brilliant strokes of orange and purple. The air was cool and clean. "You've been good for this place," Silas said, his voice a low rumble. He was looking out at the vast expanse of his land, but Alara knew he was talking about more than just the ranch. He was talking about the empty spaces inside himself. "You and the girls have been good for us," she replied softly. "You gave us a refuge, Mr. Croft." You gave us hope when we had none. He turned to look at her then. The fading light softened the harsh lines of his face, revealing the deep-seated weariness and the emerging warmth. Silas, he said. My name is Silas. The offering of his first name was a profound gesture of intimacy, a bridge built across the chasm of their formal relationship. Alara, she responded, a small smile touching her lips. I was beginning to wonder if you had a first name. A rare, fleeting grin touched his own mouth. Been a while since I had a reason to use it. They sat in a comfortable silence for a while, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. The bond between them was solidifying, forged in the crucible of shared hardship and the quiet miracle of building a new life from the wreckage of their old ones. The ranch was no longer his fortress of grief or their temporary shelter. It had become a sanctuary for them all, a testament to the idea that family was not just about blood, but about the bonds you forge in the fire. But far away, in the corrupt and dusty town they had fled, a shadow was stirring. A man accustomed to getting his own way had been thwarted, and his greed was a patient, venomous thing. The fragile peace of the Croft Ranch, as beautiful and ephemeral as a sunset, was about to be tested. The possessive tyrant, Mr. Alistair Finch, had not forgotten his lost property, and he was coming to collect. The arrival of the shadow was not sudden. It began as a whisper, a rumor carried on the wind from the town of Redemption, a name that had always dripped with irony. A lone rider, a neighboring rancher named Jedediah, stopped by the Croft Ranch one afternoon, ostensibly to ask about a stray cow, but his eyes were full of a different kind of news. He sat uncomfortably at the large kitchen table, a space now dominated by Alara's presence, and accepted a glass of water. He glanced at the girls, who were chattering softly as they mended clothes by the fire, and then looked at Silas. Heard some talk in town, Silas? Jedediah said, his voice low. A man's been asking questions. A Mr. Finch, dressed fancy, asks about a woman and a group of orphan girls. Alara, who was refilling his glass, froze. The pitcher in her hand trembled slightly. Silas's face, which had softened over the past weeks, hardened back into a mask of granite. He placed a steadying hand on her arm, a silent gesture of support. What kind of questions? Silas asked, his voice dangerously calm. He's telling folks they're his wards, Jedediah continued, shifting in his chair. Says their governess, a Miss Vance, absconded with them. Says the children are property of the Finch orphanage, and that he has the legal papers to prove it. He's offering a reward for any information on their whereabouts. The air in the room grew thick and cold. The cheerful chatter of the girls died away as they sensed the shift in mood. Alara felt a wave of nausea, the old, familiar fear coiling in her stomach. Alistair Finch. The name itself was a poison. She remembered his face, the way his thin lips would smile while his eyes remained as cold and dead as a winter snake. He was a man who saw the world as a collection of assets to be acquired and controlled. He had inherited the orphanage and had immediately seen the girls not as children to be cared for, but as a source of income from the state and, more importantly, the land grant attached to the institution, which he planned to sell to the railroad for a fortune. Alara's discovery of his forged ledgers and her subsequent flight with the children had not just been an act of mercy. It had been an act of theft against him, and he was not a man who tolerated being stolen from. He's a liar, Alara said, her voice shaking but laced with steel. The orphanage was a place of cruelty and neglect. He starved those girls. I have records, his own ledgers, that show his corruption. She had kept the small, leather-bound book hidden, a desperate piece of insurance against this very day. Silas looked at her, then back at Jedediah. This man, Finch, he's in Redemption now. He is, Jedediah confirmed. He's got the ear of the sheriff, it seems. Sheriff Miller's never been one to turn his nose up at a rich man's coin. After Jedediah left, a heavy silence descended on the ranch. The sanctuary they had built felt fragile, its walls as thin as paper against the approaching threat. The external world, which they had managed to keep at bay, was now clawing at their door. That evening, Silas called Alara out to the barn. The air was cool, smelling of hay and animals. "Show me the book," he said. It wasn't a question. She retrieved the ledger from its hiding place, wrapped in oilcloth at the bottom of her small trunk. She handed it to him. He lit a lantern, and for nearly an hour, he sat on a bale of hay, his brow furrowed in concentration as he examined the columns of figures, the falsified expenses, the clear evidence of Finch's embezzlement. "This is damning," he said finally, closing the book. "But a man like Finch, with the law in his pocket, he'll find a way to discredit it. He'll say you forged it." "Then what do we do?" Alara asked, her voice barely a whisper. The weight of her responsibility, of the 24 lives that depended on her, felt crushing. Silas stood up, his tall frame seeming to fill the entire barn. He walked over to her and, for the first time, he took both of her hands in his. His were large, calloused, and surprisingly warm. "He is not taking you," he said, his voice a low, steady vow. "And he is not taking these girls. This is your home now. I told you that you were safe here, and I meant it. A man's word is all he has in this country, Alara. And I gave you mine." He looked down at their joined hands. "He thinks he can come here with his money and his bought and paid for laws. But he's forgotten something. This is my land. And on my land, my word is the only law that matters." In his eyes, she saw not the wounded recluse, but the stoic protector she had first glimpsed. The soldier within him, long dormant, was awake now. He was a man defending his home, his family. The fear in her heart did not vanish, but it was joined by a surge of strength, a profound and powerful sense of not being alone. They were no longer just a rancher and a governess. They were partners, a unified front against the coming storm. The peaceful interlude was over. The siege was about to begin. The confrontation came sooner than they expected. Just 2 days after Jedediah's warning, 2 riders appeared on the horizon, dark figures against the bright morning sky, moving with the arrogant slowness of men who believe they own the ground they ride on. Silas saw them from the barn, and his body went still. He sent one of the older girls, Mary, running to the house with a quiet instruction. "Tell Miss Vance to take everyone inside. Bar the door and stay away from the windows. Do not come out, no matter what you hear." He watched until the girl was safely inside. Then he walked slowly to the center of his yard, his rifle held loosely but ready at his side. He stood there, a solitary, immovable figure, waiting. The riders were Alistair Finch and the town sheriff, a man named Miller with a weak chin and shifty eyes that darted everywhere but at Silas. Finch was exactly as Alara had described him, impeccably dressed in a dark suit that seemed absurdly out of place on the dusty plains, his face pale and pinched, a cruel smirk playing on his thin lips. He reined in his horse a few feet from Silas, looking down at him with an air of supreme entitlement. "You must be Croft," Finch said, his voice a condescending drawl. "I am Alistair Finch. I've come to collect my property." Silas's gaze was flat and cold as a river stone. "There's no property of yours here, Finch. Just my land and the people under my protection. I suggest you turn your horses around." Sheriff Miller, looking uncomfortable, cleared his throat. "Now, Silas, let's be reasonable. Mr. Finch here has legal papers. Warrants for the return of 24 orphan wards and a writ for the arrest of one Alara Vance on charges of kidnapping and theft." "I've seen your warrants, Miller," Silas said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "They're not worth the paper they're printed on out here. You know that as well as I do." Finch's smirk tightened. "Ah, the frontier justice speech. How quaint. Your quaint notions of honor don't supersede the law of the territory, Croft. I have the law on my side." "You have a coward with a tin star on your payroll," Silas corrected him, his eyes never leaving Finch's. "That's not the same thing." Just then, the cabin door creaked open. Alara stepped out onto the porch, her face pale but resolute. In her hands, she held the small ledger. Silas's jaw tightened. "Alara, get back inside." "No," she said, her voice clear and strong, carrying across the yard. "I will not hide while this man slanders me." She walked down the steps and came to stand beside Silas, a small, defiant figure next to his towering strength. She looked directly at Finch, her fear buried deep beneath a cold, righteous anger. "You will not take these children, Mr. Finch. Their nightmare with you is over." Finch let out a theatrical sigh of exasperation. "My dear Miss Vance, your sentimentality is touching, but utterly irrelevant. Those children are legally bound to my institution until they come of age. You stole them, and you stole my private accounting book, an act of thievery for which you will be prosecuted." "Your accounting book?" Alara's laugh was sharp and devoid of humor. "You mean your record of criminal neglect and fraud? The one that shows how you stole food and medicine money from the mouths of children? I think the territorial judge might be more interested in that than in your trumped-up charges." A flicker of unease crossed Finch's face, but he quickly masked it. "A fanciful story from a bitter, dismissed employee. It won't stand up." "It's her word against yours," Silas stated, taking a small step forward, his presence a physical shield for Alara. "And out here, a good woman's word carries a lot of weight. More than a fancy suit and a paid-off lawman." The situation had reached a tense impasse. Finch's legal authority was useless in the face of Silas's implacable will. The sheriff was clearly unnerved, his hand hovering near his pistol but his eyes showing no stomach for a real fight with a man of Silas Croft's reputation. Finch, a man used to winning his battles in boardrooms and corrupt offices, was unequipped for this kind of raw, elemental confrontation. His power was an illusion, and it was beginning to dissolve under the harsh Wyoming sun. "This is not over, Croft," Finch hissed, his voice losing its confident drawl and taking on a venomous edge. He pulled at his horse's reins, turning it sharply. "I will be back, and I will bring enough law with me to burn this place to the ground if I have to." He and a relieved-looking Sheriff Miller spurred their horses and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and impotent threats hanging in the air. Silas and Alara stood together, watching them go. The immediate danger had been repelled, but they both knew this was just the first skirmish in a longer war. He looked down at her, at the fierce courage in her eyes, and a profound sense of pride and protectiveness washed over him. She had not been a damsel in distress. She had been his partner, his fellow soldier. "You were brave," he said, the two words carrying the weight of a sonnet. "I wasn't alone," she replied, her gaze meeting his. The space between them was charged with unspoken emotion, a bond forged in defiance and sealed in shared resolve. They had won the day, but the siege had only just begun. The departure of Alistair Finch did not bring relief, but a heavy sense of anticipation. The ranch, once a sanctuary, now felt like a fort awaiting an inevitable assault. Silas knew Finch was not a man to accept defeat. He would return, and he would not come with just a single cowardly sheriff. He would use his wealth and influence to gather a posse, twisting the law into a weapon of personal vengeance. The atmosphere on the ranch became one of quiet preparation. Silas spent his days cleaning and oiling his collection of rifles, checking the perimeter of his land, and reinforcing the doors and windows of the cabin, his movements economical and grimly purposeful. The older girls, sensing the gravity of the situation, worked with a new solemnity, stockpiling firewood and water, their youthful games replaced by a shared sense of duty. Alara, however, understood that a defense built only on wood and steel would not be enough. Finch's power came from the veneer of legality and social standing. To defeat him, they needed to strip that veneer away. They needed allies. They needed to fight his lies with truth. While Silas prepared for a physical battle, Alara prepared for a moral one. She sat down with the oldest girls, the ones who remembered the Finch orphanage most clearly, and she had them write down their stories. With gentle prompting, they wrote of the cold, the hunger, the cruelty. They wrote of spoiled food and thin blankets, of Finch's verbal abuse and utter indifference to their suffering. Each account, written in the careful, looping script of a teenage girl, was a testament, a weapon far more powerful than any bullet. One afternoon, as she was compiling these heartbreaking testimonies, Silas rode out. He didn't say where he was going, only that he would be back by nightfall. He rode not towards town, but west into the sprawling, empty lands where his few neighbors lived. He visited Jedediah first, the rancher who had brought the initial warning. He laid out the situation plainly without melodrama. He spoke of Alara, of the children, and of Finch's corruption. He showed him the ledger. Jedediah, a man of quiet integrity, listened, his weathered face grim. "Finch is a sickness," Jedediah said, nodding slowly. "We all know the type. Comes from the east with money and a black heart, thinkin' they can buy the soul of this land. You and that woman, you're doing a good thing, Silas." Silas then rode to the McAllister place, and then to the homestead of the old German, Schmidt. With each visit, he did not ask for help directly. He simply told the truth, man to man, trusting in the shared code of the frontier, a code that valued honor and courage above all else. He was breaking his decade of isolation, calling in debts of neighborly respect he hadn't even known he'd accrued. He returned to his ranch as dusk was settling, to find Alara on the porch, waiting for him, the lamplight from the cabin spilling out around her. She had been watching the horizon for him for the last hour. "Did you find them?" she asked, her voice laced with anxiety. He dismounted, his face tired but resolute. "I told them the truth," he said. "The rest is up to them." The stand came 3 days later. A posse of nearly a dozen men, led by Finch and Sheriff Miller, rode up the path to the ranch. They were a grim sight, a collection of hired guns and townsfolk swayed by Finch's money and lies. But as they crested the final rise, they pulled up short. Standing in the yard with Silas Croft were not just a woman and a group of children. Jedediah was there, his rifle resting in the crook of his arm. Old Man Schmidt was there, his 2 grown sons beside him. The McAllister brothers were there, a silent, determined group of half a dozen ranchers, standing shoulder to shoulder with Silas, their faces hard, their hands steady. They were outnumbered, but they were not outmatched. Finch's face contorted in a mask of fury. This was not the isolated, vulnerable recluse he had expected. "Miller, arrest them all!" he shrieked, his voice cracking. "Arrest them for obstruction." The sheriff hesitated, looking at the line of determined, armed landowners. These were not vagrants or outlaws. These were his neighbors, the bedrock of the county. He was a coward, but he was not a fool. Firing on these men would mean a war he could not win. It was Alara who made the final move. She stepped forward, past Silas, past the line of ranchers, holding the packet of written testimonies in her hand. "Before you do anything, Sheriff," she called out, her voice ringing with unshakable authority, "I want you to read these. These are the words of the children you are here to drag back into misery. Read them, and then you can tell these men, your neighbors, that you stand with a man who profits from the suffering of orphans." She walked right up to the sheriff's horse and held the papers up to him. He flinched as if she were holding a venomous snake. His eyes darted from the papers to Finch's furious face, to the cold, waiting eyes of the ranchers. In that moment, his borrowed authority crumbled into dust. He could not do it. He could not be the man who sided with the monster against his own people. With a muttered curse, he snatched the papers from her hand. The confrontation was over. There was no grand battle, no shootout. There was only the quiet, stunning collapse of a tyrant's will. Finch, sputtering with rage and disbelief, found himself utterly alone. His hired guns and paid-off lawmen melting away from him, unwilling to cross a moral line that had been so clearly drawn in the dust. The dam of his power had been broken, not by force of arms, but by the combined courage of a resilient woman, an honorable man, and a community that remembered what it meant to stand for something right. The retreat of Alistair Finch and his dissolved posse was not a rout. It was an evaporation. They simply faded back towards town, a silent admission of a defeat so total it needed no punctuation by gunfire. As their dust settled, a profound quiet fell over the yard of the Croft Ranch. It was the quiet of a battle won, of a storm that has finally passed over, leaving the air clean and charged with the scent of rain. The neighboring ranchers, their duty done, nodded grimly to Silas. Jedediah clapped him on the shoulder, a rare gesture of physical camaraderie. "You let us know if that snake ever shows his face again," he said, and with that, they mounted their horses and rode for their own homes, leaving the new family to its hard-won peace. Silas and Alara stood together in the yard, the packet of testimonies still clutched in her hand. The 24 girls, who had watched the entire confrontation from the windows, now spilled out of the cabin, their relief and joy a palpable wave. They surrounded Alara, and for the first time, Silas saw her not just as their protector, but as their mother in every way that mattered. She was the heart of this sprawling, unconventional family. Later that evening, after the last of the celebratory stew had been eaten and the girls were settled into a sleep deeper and more peaceful than any they had known before, Silas and Alara sat on the porch. The moon was high and bright, casting the landscape in a soft, silvery light. The world felt vast and quiet and safe. "It's over," Alara said, the words a soft sigh of wonder. "He won't be back. After what happened today, his reputation in this territory is ruined. No one will stand with him now." Silas nodded, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains, their peaks like jagged teeth against the starry sky. "Men like Finch feed on fear and isolation," he said, his voice thoughtful. "They can't survive in the light of day, not when good people stand together." He turned to her, his expression uncharacteristically open, the granite walls around his heart seemingly dismantled stone by stone. "You were the one who defeated him, Alara. Not me. Not the rifles. Your courage. Your refusal to hide. You brought the light." She felt a warmth spread through her chest, a glow that had nothing to do with the cool night air. "I couldn't have done it without you, Silas. You gave me a place to stand. You gave all of us a fortress." "I thought this place was a fortress to keep the world out," he confessed, a wry, sad smile touching his lips. "But you and the girls, you turned it into a fortress to protect what's good in it." He reached out and took her hand. His touch was no longer just a gesture of support. It was a connection, a current of deep affection and shared history passing between them. "I thought I'd lost my home long ago," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought this house was just a shell, a place where I was waiting to die." He looked into her eyes, and in their stormy depths, he saw his own reflection, no longer a ghost but a living man. "You didn't lose it," she whispered, her fingers tightening around his. "It was just waiting. We were all just waiting. For you." In the quiet sanctuary of the moonlit porch, he leaned in and kissed her. It was not a kiss of fiery passion, but one of profound tenderness and deep, abiding relief. It was a kiss that sealed a promise, a testament to a love that had grown slowly and steadily, like a mighty oak, in the harsh soil of grief and adversity. It was the beginning of their happily ever after, a future built not on forgetting the scars of the past, but on the understanding that those scars had led them to each other. The ranch was no longer just a home. It was a symbol of redemption. The man who had sought only solitude had found a family. The woman who had sought only refuge had found a home. And the 24 girls who had known only cruelty had found the one thing they had never dared to dream of: the unconditional, unwavering love of a mother and a father. And so, the story of the stoic rancher and the resilient governess became a quiet legend in that corner of Wyoming. It was a story not written in books, but in the life that flourished on the Croft Ranch. Silas and Alara were married the following spring, in a simple ceremony in their own yard, attended by the ranchers who had stood with them and the 24 girls who were their bridesmaids, their witnesses and their beloved daughters. The ranch, once a place of silence and sorrow, became a beacon of hope and life. It was a place of learning, of laughter, of hard work and deep love. Alistair Finch was never seen in the territory again. His power, built on a foundation of lies, had crumbled to dust, and he had vanished like the coward he was. The legal claim to the girls was quietly dropped, and with the help of a circuit judge who had heard the story and reviewed Alara's ledger, Silas and Alara became the legal guardians of all 24 children. They were no longer orphans. They were the Croft girls. Years passed as gracefully as the changing seasons on the plains. The little girls grew into young women, each one bearing the indelible mark of the love and security they had found. They learned to be strong and resilient like Alara, and honorable and steadfast like Silas. They learned to ride and mend, to read and reason, to be kind and to stand for what was right. The ranch expanded. New barns were built, more land was cultivated. Some of the older girls married local boys and started their own homesteads nearby, turning the once isolated ranch into the heart of a thriving community. Others, with the encouragement of Alara, who never lost her belief in the power of education, went east to study, becoming teachers and nurses, carrying the light of the Croft ranch out into the wider world. But they always returned. Christmas and summer holidays saw the old cabin filled to bursting once again with laughter, with stories, and with new generations of children, the grandchildren of Silas and Alara, who looked at their grandparents with awe as the living legends they were. Silas, the man who had been frozen in grief, thawed completely. The lines on his face, once etched by sorrow, were softened by years of laughter. He taught his grandsons to carve wooden horses and his granddaughters to read the sky. He was the patriarch of a clan he had never expected. His heart, once a desolate landscape, now a fertile valley. Alara remained the quiet, steady center of their world. Her hair gained streaks of silver, but her eyes never lost their fire. She was the matriarch, the teacher, the confidant, the living embodiment of the defiant hope that had led them all to this incredible life. One golden evening, in the twilight of their years, they sat together on the porch, watching another spectacular sunset. The sounds of their grandchildren playing in the yard filled the air. Silas took her hand, its skin now soft and wrinkled, and held it to his lips. "Did you ever imagine this?" he asked, his voice a low, contented rumble. "All this life." She leaned her head against his shoulder, a gesture as familiar and comfortable as breathing. "I only imagined a safe place, my love," she whispered. "I never dared to dream that the safest place in the world would also be the most beautiful. And so we come to the end of our story. But is it really an end? Or is it a beginning? It's a story that reminds us that homes are not just built with wood and stone, but with courage and compassion. It shows us that family is not always the one we are born into, but the one we find, the one we fight for, the one we build together. The human heart, like the wild frontier, can be a harsh and unforgiving place, can be frozen by grief, scarred by cruelty. But it is also a place of astonishing resilience, capable of thawing, of healing, and of blooming in the most unexpected ways. The greatest darkness can be overcome by a single, defiant light, and the deepest silence can be broken by the voices of those we choose to love. What walls have you built around your own heart? And who might be waiting on the other side, if only you had the courage to open the door? If this story of love, redemption, and the incredible power of a found family touched your soul, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more inspirational stories. And in the comments below, we invite you to share your own story of a time when a stranger showed you kindness, or when you found a family in a place you least expected. Because every one of those stories is a light in the darkness, and the world needs all the light it can get.